The Marigold Diner over in Carroll Gardens had been feeding the same working people for 31 years. And in all that time, nobody had ever heard the place go completely quiet. On a Tuesday morning in October, it did. There was a television crew wedged between the booths, cameras rolling, and a celebrity chef named Brandon Keene, standing too close to the waitress he'd been sent to interview. Her name was Tessa Barlow, 27 years old, thin in the way people get when they work 2 jobs and eat standing up, wearing the only good dress she owned, a faded red one with small flowers on it, under a canvas apron gone soft from too many washings. There was an old burn scar on her left wrist. She'd already said no. Twice. She'd said it clearly, in front of a room full of witnesses and a camera that hadn't stopped recording. Brandon Keene laughed like she was playing some kind of game, took hold of that scarred wrist, and leaned in anyway. Her palm came up flat against his chest and shoved. Then she slapped him hard enough that the sound cracked off the tile floor and came back down twice from the tin ceiling. Somebody's coffee cup rattled in its saucer. Nobody else moved, and then a voice came from table 6. Quiet, unhurried, the kind of quiet that makes a room forget how to breathe. Take your mouth off her. The man who said it had been eating the same $12 breakfast 3 mornings a week for over a month. He always sat with his back to the wall. He always tipped exactly 15%, because Tessa had refused to take anything more. He crossed that floor without hurrying, closed one hand around the lapel of Brandon Keene's linen jacket, and moved him away from her the way a man moves a chair out of his path. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't raise a hand. And in that same half-second, every person in the Marigold understood that the polite regular from table 6 wasn't who any of them had assumed he was. Tessa understood it too. She stepped between them, put her hand against that dark suit, and pushed him back. "I don't need another man deciding what happens to me," she said. Not one person in that diner knew whose sleeve she'd just shoved. Not one of them knew that the quietest customer in the room was the most dangerous man in Brooklyn, or that he'd been walking through that door week after week for a reason that had nothing to do with breakfast. Tessa didn't know it either, and she wouldn't find out until it was far too late to walk away. If stories about ordinary courage and second chances mean something to you, take a second to hit like on this video, share it with someone who could use it today, and subscribe so you don't miss what we bring you next. Now let's go back to the Marigold Diner, to the moment it all began, when a man who owned half a waterfront walked in and ordered eggs. 5 weeks before that Tuesday morning, Tessa Barlow slipped her key into the lock of the Marigold while the entire street was still dark, except for the street lamp at the corner of Court Street. She pushed the door open with her shoulder out of habit, because the bottom hinge had been out of alignment since the previous winter, and no one had the money to call a repairman. Inside, it was dark and warm, with the faint scent of yesterday's coffee still lingering in the wood grain. She ran her hand along the wall and flipped on the switches one by one, and the diner emerged in sections. The row of worn red leather booths, the old stone countertop, the small table number sign hanging from a post. Marisol Ortega was already in the kitchen, an apron tied around her waist and flour dusting both hands. She lived directly upstairs, only 20 wooden steps away from the diner, and there had never been a single morning when Tessa opened the doors without someone already waiting behind them. Without turning around, she called out that the oven was acting up again, that if it agreed to bake the bread properly and on time today, it would be a miracle, and that if it didn't, the regulars would once again have to eat bread with burned edges and pretend they liked it that way. Tessa laughed, tied on her apron, and began her work. She took the chairs down from the tables, wiped every pane of glass, and arranged the sugar jars and hot sauce bottles in the exact order Mrs. Marisol had taught her when she was still a 16-year-old girl washing dishes after school. When she pulled open the cash register drawer to count the change, the stack of white envelopes tucked underneath shifted upward slightly. She pushed them back down, closed the drawer, and didn't open a single one. They'd been lying there for several weeks. Each bore the same hospital's name in the upper left corner, and she knew what was written inside without having to tear one open, because it was the same every month, except for the number on the final line. At 5:45, the back door opened, and Micah came in with his backpack hanging crookedly from one shoulder, and his hair still wet from washing it. The 11-year-old boy sat down at the corner table beside the window, the one everyone considered his table, spread out his schoolbooks, and began doing his homework before it was time to leave for school. Tessa brought him a cup of warm milk and placed it where he could see it, never behind his back, because that was a private rule between the brother and sister. Micah looked up and signed to ask whether it was Thursday, because Thursday was the day Mrs. Marisol made apple pie. Tessa signed back that it was only Tuesday, and that if he asked that question one more time, Mrs. Marisol would hear him, and she would make apple pie on a Tuesday, and then the entire neighborhood would collapse because the order of the universe had been broken. Micah laughed aloud, his laughter a little louder than usual, as it always was, and Marisol shouted from the kitchen that she could hear everything, that she wasn't deaf, and that the two of them had better not speak badly about the woman holding the skillet. Tessa laughed and quickly signed Marisol's words to her brother. Micah turned to his sister and signed back that Marisol said she wasn't deaf, and Tessa signed back that yes, that was true. He was the only one who couldn't hear, and they both laughed. It was the oldest joke between them, so old that neither could remember who had thought of it first, and it was still every bit as funny as it had been the first time. Micah turned over an old receipt, took out a pencil, and began to draw. He sketched Mr. Delaney sitting at table 3, the man who ordered black coffee every morning and never finished it, capturing even the way he rested his chin in his hand and stared out the window as though he were waiting for someone who would never come. Tessa looked over his shoulder, whistled softly, then signed that if Mr. Delaney saw that picture, he would demand to adopt Micah as his grandson. At 6 o'clock, the first customer pushed open the door. Then came the second, and the third. The diner began to fill with its familiar clamor, the sound of spoons striking plates, Mrs. Marisol calling out orders from the kitchen, someone complaining about the team from the night before. Tessa made her rounds with the coffee pot, greeting each person by name without needing to ask what they drank. Just before 7, she saw Micah to the door, straightened the strap of his backpack, and signed that she would pick him up a little later that afternoon. The boy nodded, signed back that she shouldn't forget to eat something, then ran down the steps. Tessa stood watching until he disappeared around the corner. When she went back into the kitchen for more coffee, she saw it. A sheet of paper had been taped to the kitchen door, its edges still curling because the tape hadn't been pressed down firmly, with the building management company's heading printed in bold, and a new figure in the middle for the next rent payment. Mrs. Marisol stood with her back turned at the stove and said nothing at all. At some point, without anyone noticing, she had posted it there, in a place only she and Tessa ever passed, and she hadn't mentioned it to anyone. That same morning, less than 3 miles away, inside a corrugated metal warehouse at the Red Hook docks, 6 men were arguing over a shipment being held by customs. They stood around an iron table in the middle of the warehouse, their voices rising over one another, their fingers pointing, and not one of them willing to listen. Then, the side door opened. The man who entered didn't say a word. He removed his coat, hung it over the back of the empty chair at the head of the table, pulled the chair out, and sat down. The argument died completely before he touched the seat. 11 seconds passed in a silence none of the 6 men dared to break. Nico Ferrante didn't look around the room. He looked down at the tabletop, tapped one finger exactly twice, then raised his eyes. He asked 3 questions. On what date had the shipment been detained? Who had signed the final receipt? And who had called customs before the documents were filed? 3 questions, each shorter than the one before it. The first man answered. The second man answered. When they reached the third question, the fourth man from the head of the table cleared his throat and said he wasn't sure, that it might have been someone in the documentation department, and that he would check. Nico allowed those words to remain suspended in the room for another moment. Then, his voice still as calm as if he were asking the time, he said the man had 2 choices. He could repeat what he'd just said, or Nico could say it for him. No one moved. The fourth man looked down at his feet, then looked up, then gave them a name, an amount of money, and the details of a telephone call he should never have made. Nico nodded once. He told the man standing by the door that the shipment would be released before noon the following day, that the paperwork would be filed again from the beginning, and that from that day forward, the documentation department would report directly to Gideon. Then he stood, took his coat, and walked out. The entire meeting lasted less than 4 minutes. Gideon Walsh was waiting outside the door with a thin stack of papers in his hand. He walked with Nico to the car, and along the way, he said there was trouble in Carroll Gardens. For the past few weeks, someone had been knocking on the doors of small businesses in the neighborhood, a laundromat, a shoe repair shop, a diner, and telling them that a new owner would soon be taking over their buildings, and that they should find somewhere else to go before things became unpleasant, and that person had been using the Ferrante name. Nico stopped in the middle of the parking lot. Gideon asked whether he wanted him to send someone down to have a look. Nico said no. He said that if the man was an outsider, it was nothing more than an afternoon's work. But if the man came from inside his own house, then he couldn't ask someone from that same house to find him. Gideon studied him for a moment, then asked under what name he intended to go. Nico opened the car door and said he would think of something dull enough that no one would bother asking another question. The following morning, the bell above the Marigold's door rang twice, and Tessa looked up from the stack of bills in front of her. The man who entered looked unlike anyone who had ever pushed open that door on a Wednesday morning. He didn't look at the menu hanging on the wall. He looked at the ceiling, along the eastern wall, out the window, then toward the kitchen door, and only then did he look at her. He said his name was Nick Rowe, that he worked in commercial property appraisal, and that he needed to see a copy of the diner's lease. Tessa set down her pen. She looked him over from his shoes to his collar, slowly and without the slightest hurry, then asked whether he'd really put on a suit worth 6 months of rent for that place just to come measure the walls. The man's expression didn't change. He said his company worked with building owners, and that this was standard procedure. Tessa said she'd been standing behind that counter since she was 16, and that standard procedure came with paperwork bearing a company name, a telephone number someone could actually call, and a person at the other end of the line who knew what he was talking about. He held out a business card. She took it, read it, then placed it on the counter and pushed it back toward him. She said the lease wasn't hers, that it belonged to Mrs. Marisol, that Marisol was in the kitchen and could come out to speak with him any time he brought something more convincing than a piece of cardstock with pretty lettering printed on it. Nick Rowe looked at her for another second. Then he asked which table was available. She pointed toward table 6, the one beside the window with its back against the wall. He ordered fried eggs and toast burned around the edges. He finished everything, said nothing more, read something on his phone, then stood and walked out. When Tessa cleared the table, she found a banknote tucked beneath the edge of his plate, folded in half. $100 bill. She picked it up, went to the door, and called after him on the sidewalk. He stopped and turned around. She held out the money and said she'd served him a $12 breakfast. He said it was a tip. She said no, it was something else, and she didn't know what that something was. But she knew for certain that it wasn't a tip. She placed the bill in his hand, folded his fingers around it, then turned and went back inside. Nico Ferrante stood on the sidewalk in Carroll Gardens, amid the blare of a bus horn and the smell of bread drifting from the kitchen, holding money that no one in his life had ever returned to him. 3 nights a week, after the lights at the Marigold had gone dark, Tessa took the subway into Manhattan to work her second shift. The cleaning company paid by the hour and didn't ask many questions, and her job was to clean the glass in an office building near the financial district, the kind of building where, during the day, security would stop her in the lobby if she tried to enter without a badge. At night, it was different. At night, she had a key to the service elevator, a supply cart, and an empty floor somewhere in the 40s that she could walk across alone from one end to the other. She cleaned panes of glass twice her height, and beyond them, the whole city stretched out like a glowing circuit board. Some nights, she stopped for exactly 1 minute just to look at it. Only 1 minute. Then she pulled her cart onward. In the pocket of her apron, she always carried an old phone, the kind that had gone out of fashion long ago, set to vibrate as strongly as it could. She carried it everywhere, even when her hands were wet, even when she was high above the ground. It wasn't for calling anyone. It existed only to receive messages from a single number. Micah couldn't hear a fire alarm. He couldn't hear a knock at the door or someone calling his name from the next room, and Tessa had taught him from a very young age that if anything happened, no matter how small, all he had to do was send her a message. She'd never had to receive a message like that. But 3 nights a week, she still kept that phone pressed against her hip like a hand holding on to her. On those nights, Micah wasn't at home. The boy carried his backpack up the 20 wooden steps behind the kitchen and slept in Mrs. Marisol's apartment upstairs, in the small room she had cleared out years earlier and hadn't allowed anyone to touch since. She kept milk waiting in the refrigerator, left the hallway light on all night, and whenever Micah looked up, she made sure she was within his sight instead of standing behind him, because she'd learned that rule from Tessa too. She didn't know much sign language, only a few dozen words, and she used those same few dozen words over and over with complete confidence, getting them spectacularly wrong and making Micah bend double with laughter every night. Once, the boy signed to his sister that Mrs. Marisol had just told him she was about to cook a chair, At 4 o'clock in the morning, Tessa returned to Carroll Gardens, and on mornings after her night shift, Mrs. Marisol opened the diner while Tessa came in for the noon shift. That was how it went, week after week, and in much the same way, the man named Nick Rowe kept coming back. He didn't ask about the lease again, nor did he explain why he was still in the neighborhood. He simply came in 3 mornings a week, always sat at table 6, always kept his back to the wall, and always chose the chair facing the door. He ordered the same meal so consistently that Mrs. Marisol no longer needed to wait for Tessa to call it back to the kitchen. He read something on his phone, sometimes wrote in a leather-bound notebook, and every time the bell above the door rang, his eyes lifted for exactly half a second before dropping again. Tessa noticed those things. She noticed them very carefully, but she didn't ask, because in 11 years behind that counter, she'd learned that everyone who walked into a diner at 6 o'clock in the morning carried something they didn't want anyone asking about. One morning, Micah sat at the corner table doing his homework, and the boy kept looking up toward table 6, then lowering his head to draw, then looking up again. When he finished, he rose on his own, crossed the floor, placed the receipt face down in front of the stranger, then returned to his seat without waiting for a reaction. Nick Rowe turned the paper over. On the back of the receipt was a pencil portrait of him, drawn with the clumsy lines of a child, yet somehow capturing the very thing no one in the diner had ever spoken aloud, that this man was sitting here without ever truly being here, that his eyes were always fixed on the door. He studied the drawing for a long time, then he folded it in half once more, and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat, the pocket over the left side of his chest. He didn't say anything to Micah. The boy didn't look up either. When Nick rose to pay, he left exactly 15%, not a penny more, because she'd told him to. There was one thing about the marigold that Nick Rowe didn't know until that Tuesday morning, and it was the reason he'd chosen the wrong day to arrive early. Every Tuesday morning, at around 9 o'clock, after the working crowd had cleared out, and the only people left in the diner were those who had nowhere else they needed to be, Mrs. Marisol Ortega wiped her hands on her apron, came out of the kitchen, pulled a chair into the middle of the aisle, put on her glasses, and opened the community newspaper to that particular page. No one had to say a word. Chairs turned toward her almost by themselves. Mr. Delaney at table 3 pushed his unfinished coffee aside. The 2 elderly women who always sat at table 4 stopped talking, and Mrs. Marisol began reading aloud Ruth Calloway's letters to the morning column. Nick Rowe was sitting at table 6, with half a plate of eggs still in front of him, when he realized there was no way to leave without walking directly past the place where she sat, so he stayed where he was. That week's letter came from a man whose wife had recently died, and he wanted to know how long it would be before he was allowed to stop feeling guilty every time he laughed. Mrs. Marisol read slowly, pausing in all the right places, in the voice of someone who had read this column for so many years that she knew which sentences needed to be allowed to fall into silence. When she finished and folded the newspaper, the entire diner remained quiet for about 3 seconds. Then the elderly woman at table 4, Mrs. Rosetta, who, according to Mrs. Marisol, had lived so long that she no longer saw any need to be polite to anyone, tapped her finger against the tabletop and said that Ruth had been too gentle this time. The whole diner turned toward her. Mrs. Rosetta went on, saying that Ruth kept circling around the point, that the man had asked a very direct question and she'd answered him as though she were afraid he might break apart, and that sometimes people needed someone to look them straight in the face and say, "Enough now, you're allowed to laugh." Several people nodded. Mr. Delaney said he thought Ruth had struck just the right balance. Mrs. Rosetta said he thought everything struck just the right balance. And in the middle of it all, a voice came from table 6, saying that Ruth hadn't circled around anything, that she'd answered him that way because the man hadn't asked the question he truly wanted answered, and that if she'd answered him directly, she would have answered the wrong question. The whole diner turned around, every single person, all at once. Nick Rowe sat there with his fork still in his hand, and the expression of a man who had just heard his own voice speaking from somewhere outside his body. Mrs. Rosetta adjusted her glasses, narrowed her eyes at him, then asked who he was. He said he was only having breakfast. Mrs. Rosetta said she was only having breakfast too, but she didn't speak as though she knew Ruth Calloway personally. Tessa stood behind the counter with the coffee pot in her hand. She set it down, folded her arms, and asked whether Mrs. Calloway's attorney had anything else he'd like to submit. The entire diner erupted in laughter. Mr. Delaney slapped his thigh. Mrs. Marisol laughed so hard she had to take off her glasses and wipe them. Nick Rowe opened his mouth, closed it again, then looked down at his plate of eggs as though the answer might already be waiting there. He said he read the column. Tessa asked how long he'd been reading it. He said a long time. She asked how long a long time was. He said he couldn't remember. She nodded thoughtfully, refilled Mr. Delaney's coffee, then said that was strange, because people usually remembered the first time they read something if it mattered enough for them to defend it in a diner full of strangers at 9 o'clock on a Tuesday morning. The diner laughed again. Mrs. Rosetta said she took back what she'd said, that she still thought Ruth had been too gentle, but this young man was far too severe, and that the two of them ought to meet and split the difference. Nick Rowe lowered his head and finished his eggs in absolute silence, and for the first time in many years, he didn't have a single thing to say in return. When the laughter faded and everyone went back to their coffee, Tessa walked over to table 6 to clear his plate. She paused for a moment. Then, without looking at him, her voice as ordinary as if she were talking about the weather, she said that Mrs. Rosetta had been wrong about one thing. He looked up. She said Ruth didn't hand anyone a handkerchief. That she'd never handed anyone a handkerchief. That she only sat down beside them, sitting quietly, never urging them to stop crying, never telling them everything would be all right, simply sitting there. And that Tessa knew this not because she'd read a great deal. She stacked the plates in her hand, turned half a step away, then added that she knew because once Ruth had sat down beside her. He came back that evening after closing time, something he'd never done before. Tessa was wiping down the counter when she saw him standing outside the glass door. She unlocked it, let him in, then locked it again behind him, and said the kitchen had been closed for hours, that all she had left was cold coffee and a corner of an apple pie Mrs. Marisol had forgotten to put away. He said that was more than enough. They sat at table 6, with only one row of lights still glowing above the counter, while outside, the entire street had gone dark. For a long while, he said nothing. Then he asked the question he'd been carrying with him since Tuesday morning. He asked what she'd meant when she said Ruth had once sat down beside her. Tessa turned the cup in her hands exactly once. Then she told him. 4 years earlier, her parents had died in an accident on the highway, and Micah, who was still very young at the time, had lost most of his hearing. She said it in a level voice, adding nothing and leaving nothing out. The voice of someone who had been forced to repeat those words often enough that they no longer broke her apart halfway through. 3 weeks after the funeral, she was 23 years old, sitting in the middle of an apartment filled with unopened boxes, and she didn't know how to tell the boy. Not how to tell him that their parents were dead. He already understood that. She didn't know how to make him understand that they weren't coming back, that this wasn't a long trip, that the door would never open for them again. She'd asked every adult she knew, and they had all told her the same thing, that time would help her. So that night, she wrote a letter to the community newspaper, addressed to a woman she'd never met named Ruth Calloway. She didn't ask for money. She didn't ask anyone to help her. She asked only one question. How was she supposed to tell him? Then she dropped the letter into the mailbox and forgot about it, because she imagined letters like hers must be piled into a mountain somewhere, unread by anyone. 3 weeks later, she received a reply. It was handwritten, not typed, not printed, not a form letter sent to everyone. Tessa took her wallet from the pocket of her apron, opened an inner compartment, and drew out a piece of paper folded into quarters, its creases worn so white they were nearly torn through, one corner repaired with clear tape that had yellowed with age. She placed it on the table between them. The man sitting across from her looked down. He recognized his own handwriting. He recognized the way he formed the first letter of every sentence, the habit of pressing the pen a little harder at the beginning, the space he always left between each line. He remembered the night he'd written it. He remembered answering 3 letters that week, as he did every week, and he remembered why he'd chosen this one from among thousands. He said nothing. Tessa unfolded the paper and read aloud the words she'd committed to memory long ago. That real love never asked a person to make themselves smaller. That if someone loved you only in a place without light, then that wasn't light. It was a hiding place. Then she folded it again, returned it to her wallet, and said that at first, Ruth had written those words for Micah, so Tessa would know how to tell the boy he didn't need to make himself smaller to fit inside someone else's grief. But several years later, she'd realized they had been written for her too. She told him about Grant Mercer, the man she'd once intended to marry. He loved her. She'd never doubted that. He loved her in the kitchen, in the car, on evenings when no one else was around. But he'd never once taken her to a company party. He'd never once mentioned Micah in front of his family. He always had a reason, and every reason made sense, until the day she read that letter again and understood that for 2 years she'd been living in a hiding place she'd mistaken for a home. The man sitting across from her still said nothing. He'd written those words while thinking of his mother, of her final years, when she lay in the hospital and told him never to become a man who dared to love someone only where no one else could see. He'd written those words down so he could hold on to her. He'd never known where they had gone. After Tessa left, he sat alone in his car for a long time. Then he opened his computer, signed into the old transportation records system belonging to the companies that carried his family's name, and began tracing backward to find out who was using the Ferrante name in Carroll Gardens. He scrolled through hundreds of entries. Then he stopped at one, not because it had anything to do with the neighborhood, but because of the surname it contained. A compensation settlement from 4 years earlier. A signature. Barlow. He hadn't yet opened the attached file when his phone vibrated. It was Gideon Walsh. In a few terse words, Gideon said someone was offering documents for sale, that the buyer was the press, and that what was being sold was Ruth Calloway's true identity. The television crew arrived on a Tuesday morning, nearly an hour earlier than scheduled, which Tessa should have found strange. The program was called Hidden Plates, a show that filmed modest neighborhood diners, and for Mrs. Marisol, this was her last chance, though she'd never spoken those last 2 words aloud. She only said that if the diner appeared on television, people might come, and perhaps the coming winter would be easier to survive. Tessa stood in the middle of the diner, surrounded by tangled electrical cables and 3 tripods being set up, and stated her conditions in front of the entire crew, slowly and loudly enough for everyone to hear. No staging. No scene would be arranged without her being told in advance. No surprises of any kind. She said she would answer every question about the food, about Mrs. Marisol, and about the diner, but she wouldn't perform. The director, a young man with headphones around his neck, nodded immediately. He nodded so quickly that Tessa hadn't even finished speaking before he turned away to adjust the angle of the 3rd camera, the one pointed toward table 6 instead of the kitchen. When the crew's final van pulled away from the street, the Marigold looked as though a great gust of wind had swept through it. Chairs had been knocked over, a stack of menus lay scattered beneath a table, and strips of yellow tape still clung to the floor. Mrs. Marisol had shown the remaining customers to the door. Tessa picked up the broom, then put it down again because her hands were still trembling, and she didn't want anyone to see her drop something. The man named Nick Rowe picked up the chairs one by one and set them upright without saying a word, doing it with the painstaking care of someone trying to find something, anything, to occupy his hands. Tessa passed the small shelf beside the cash register where Mrs. Marisol kept a few old books for customers to borrow, and she pulled out the latest collection by Ruth Calloway. She walked over and placed it in his hands. He took it by reflex. She said that since he was already standing there, he could explain something to her. He asked what. She said she'd read that collection 3 times, and every time, something about the final 3 chapters had felt wrong. He opened the book, then closed it again. He asked what had seemed wrong to her. Tessa leaned against the edge of the counter, folded her arms, and said that throughout the entire book, Ruth told people they had to speak. She told the wife to speak to her husband. She told the child to speak to their father before it was too late. She told the man who had just lost his wife to tell people he wasn't all right, instead of continuing to answer that he was fine. Then, in the final 3 chapters, when Ruth wrote about herself, she revealed nothing at all. She wrote about other people. She wrote beautifully and powerfully, in a way that made everyone who read her words cry. Yet she didn't say a single word about who she was. The man sat down on the edge of the chair he'd just set upright. He said perhaps she was afraid. Tessa asked what she was afraid of. He said she might have been afraid that if she told the truth, she would lose everything, that some people had too much to lose, and that there were people whose writing would be read differently if the world knew who they were, and perhaps Ruth believed silence was the only way to preserve the value those letters held for their readers. He spoke slowly, as though he were laying out each word while he said it. Tessa shook her head. She said that if that was true, Ruth wasn't protecting anyone. He looked up. She said Ruth was protecting her own control, that she wanted to decide how people were allowed to know her, how much they were allowed to care for her, and how close they were allowed to come. That wasn't protecting the readers. It was protecting herself. And people confuse those two things all the time. Tessa picked up the broom. She said she'd lived for 2 years with a man who had done exactly that, and he'd always had a very kind and reasonable explanation for everything he refused to say. She began to sweep. The man sat motionless on the chair in the middle of the diner, still holding his own book in his hands, while the only sound left in the room was the broom moving across the tile floor. His phone vibrated just as he opened the car door. Gideon Walsh didn't say hello or ask where he was. He only said he'd had his people investigate the Hidden Plates crew since that morning, and that Nico needed to hear everything before he said a word. The television network hadn't commissioned the shoot. There was no production schedule, no approved budget, and no one in the editorial department knew anything about the Marigold. The entire crew had been hired privately and paid in cash through a small production company established less than 2 months earlier, and their contract contained a clause no food program in the world would ever need, stating that ownership of all the raw footage would belong to the client rather than the network. Nico stood motionless beside the car door. Gideon continued, saying he'd reviewed the camera layout. 3 cameras. The first had been placed in the corner for a wide view of the room. The second had rested on the lead cameraman's shoulder, moving with Brandon Keene. But the third camera, the one that should have been pointed at the kitchen to capture the cooking, the one no program about food could do without, had been fixed on a tripod and aimed directly at table 6. It had been set up there before Nico entered the diner that morning. It hadn't moved throughout the entire shoot, and when everything happened, it hadn't turned toward Brandon Keene, Tessa, or the crowd. It had remained exactly where it was, staring directly at the place where Nico sat. Nico asked who had paid the production company. Gideon said the money had passed through 3 accounts before disappearing, and that he needed more time. But all 3 accounts had been opened at the same bank branch during the same week. Nico asked what Brandon Keene knew. Gideon said the actor knew only his part. He'd been paid to create a shocking moment in front of the cameras, told it was a publicity stunt arranged with the diner, and he'd believed it because he'd done things like that many times before, and no one had ever slapped him. Nico stood there on the sidewalk in Carroll Gardens, and inside his mind, everything rearranged itself into its proper order. No one hired 3 cameras and a celebrity to film a diner. They hired them to force a man who never allowed himself to be photographed into doing something before he had time to think. They hadn't needed the slap. The slap had been Tessa's, and no one had anticipated it. What they'd been waiting for from the beginning was his reaction. They needed footage of him rising from his seat. They needed to see him cross the floor. They needed that exact half-second of his face when his hand closed around the other man's lapel, and they needed it in high enough resolution, from a fixed angle, without shaking or losing focus, inside a diner with enough witnesses that no one could claim it had been staged. Nico asked Gideon whether the video had been posted yet. Gideon fell silent for a moment, then said it had gone up 40 minutes earlier, not on the program's page, on a newly created account, posted at dawn, and in only 40 minutes, it had been shared so many times that no one could count them anymore. But the problem wasn't the video. The problem was the caption beneath it. The caption said nothing about the diner, nothing about the waitress, and nothing about the television chef. It asked only one question: who was the man in this video? And directly beneath it was a link. The link opened an image of a handwritten manuscript page, the heavy pressure on the first letter of every sentence, the familiar spacing between the lines, and in the upper corner, the title, Letters to the Morning, and the name, Ruth Calloway. Nico sat down behind the wheel but didn't start the engine. For the past several weeks, he'd believed he was dealing with 2 separate matters. Someone was borrowing his family's name to intimidate small business tenants in Carroll Gardens, and someone was offering Ruth Calloway's identity for sale to the press. He'd come to the neighborhood because of the first matter. He'd stayed for another reason. And now both matters were sitting in a single caption beneath a video recorded by the third camera. It wasn't 2 people. It wasn't 2 schemes. There was only one, and whoever it was had known exactly which table he would sit at, on which morning, before he'd even known he would return to that diner for a second time. By noon, the entire city knew. Not about the diner, not about the waitress, but about the man who sat at table 6. The Ferrante name appeared on every screen, beside another name that, until that morning, had belonged to a widow in her 70s whom millions of people believed was real. The telephone inside the Marigold rang without stopping until Mrs. Marisol pulled the cord from the wall. Outside the glass door, people were already standing on the sidewalk taking photographs through the window. Nick Rowe, or rather the man Tessa had called by that name until then, was standing in the middle of the diner when Mrs. Marisol came out of the kitchen holding her phone, her face drained of color. She said nothing. She only handed it to Tessa. Tessa took it. On the screen was an image of a handwritten manuscript page, enlarged enough to show every stroke of ink, every place where the pen had pressed down hard at the beginning of a sentence, every space left between the lines. She studied it for a long time, then she placed the phone on the counter, and with her other hand, she took her wallet from her apron pocket, opened the inner compartment, and drew out the piece of paper, folded into quarters. She unfolded it slowly, as carefully as she always did, because the creases were so worn that the slightest haste might tear them. Then she laid it beside the phone. The 2 pages rested side by side on the stone counter. The first letter of every sentence bore the same heavy pressure. The spacing between the lines was equally wide. The way the writer curved the tail of a letter downward and drew it back up was so identical that no one needed to explain anything more. Mrs. Marisol retreated into the kitchen and closed the door. Only 2 people remained in the diner. Tessa didn't look up right away. She stood there staring down at the 2 pieces of paper, and inside her mind, one thing after another began settling into its proper place. The chair he always chose, with his back to the wall and a clear view of the door, the way his eyes lifted for exactly half a second whenever the bell rang. The calls he never answered inside the diner, always stepping out onto the sidewalk instead. The banknote beneath the edge of his plate on that first morning. The lease renewal letter Mrs. Marisol had received more than 2 weeks earlier, without a word of explanation, after she'd prepared herself for the opposite. Even that Tuesday morning when he'd defended a woman who didn't exist in front of a diner full of strangers, then sat in silence like a child caught in the act when Tessa asked how long he'd been reading the column. Tessa stepped back. Only 1 step, and not because she was afraid. She stepped back in the way someone retreats from a painting after standing too close, when at last they can see the whole thing they've been standing inside for so long without knowing it. In a very quiet voice, she asked who he was. He gave her his name, Nico Ferrante. Nothing more. Not one word to make it easier to hear. She nodded slowly, as though acknowledging a piece of information about the weather. Then she asked her second question. She asked whether, on that first morning, when he'd walked in and told her his name was Nick Rowe, he'd been searching for someone who was using his name. He said yes. She asked whether, if he'd given his real name, that person would have known he was looking for them. He said yes. Tessa looked down at the paper, folded into quarters on the counter, then raised her eyes to him again. She said she understood the first day, that she truly understood, that anyone in his position would have done the same, and that she didn't blame him for a single thing about that day. Then she fell silent. She allowed the silence to stretch long enough for him to know that the next question was coming. Then she asked about all the days that followed. What about the morning he sat listening to Mrs. Rosetta accuse Ruth of being too gentle? What about the night he knocked on the diner's door after closing, sat down at table 6, and asked her about those words? What about the moment she opened her wallet in front of him, the moment she placed the most precious thing she owned on the table and read it aloud for him? Nico Ferrante stood there. He was the man whose presence made an entire warehouse at the Red Hook docks hold its breath when he pulled out a chair and sat down. He'd faced people capable of destroying him and had never lost a single breath. And now he stood in the middle of a small diner in Carroll Gardens before a woman waiting for an answer, and he couldn't find one worthy of her question, so he said nothing. And that silence was the clearest answer she received. By that evening, the story was no longer news. It had become a joke. Late-night shows worked it into their opening monologues. People placed photographs of him in a dark suit beside the pastel covers of paperback books. Someone even created a short video of him reading letters of comfort in a deep voice, and it received more views than everything written about him over the course of many years combined. On the upper floors of the office building, things unfolded differently, though no less painfully. No one dared mention it. People entered his office, delivered their reports, then left, and not one of them looked directly into his eyes for more than 2 seconds. A young manager from the logistics department, still not wise enough to understand the value of silence, came in to deliver a file, and as he turned to leave, he blurted out that the letter to the carpenter who had lost his son was his favorite. The moment the words left his mouth, he realized what he'd said. His face went white. He apologized, said he didn't know why he'd said such a thing, then practically ran from the room. Nico sat there alone and realized that what was dissolving wasn't his reputation. It was fear. the fear he'd built brick by brick over so many years, evaporating in a single night. Curtis Vance entered shortly before midnight, carrying a prepared statement. He placed it on the desk and said he'd taken care of the problem. The statement said that Letters to the Morning had long been the product of a team of outside editors, that Ruth Calloway was a publishing brand rather than a real person, that the Ferrante family had served only as a financial sponsor, and that the handwritten pages circulating online had been stolen and manipulated. Curtis said that all Nico had to do was sign, and within 3 days, no one would remember any of it. He said people feared Nico because they believed nothing could touch him, and that those letters had shattered that belief. Nico read the entire statement. He thought of the nights after his mother died, the nights when he'd sat writing until dawn because it was the only way he knew to speak with her. He folded the paper in half, pushed it back toward Curtis, and said the letters hadn't shattered anything. Curtis asked him to repeat himself, saying he hadn't heard clearly. Nico said they'd only exposed what was already there. In Carroll Gardens, Tessa closed the diner in the early afternoon and drew the curtains. Reporters lined the sidewalk, knocking on the glass, calling her name through the gap in the door, while some whispered among themselves that she must have known from the beginning that no one could possibly fail to recognize a man who ate breakfast in their diner 3 mornings a week. The first thing she did wasn't call a lawyer or anyone else. She called Micah's school and arranged for him to stay home for a few days, beginning that very afternoon, before anyone had time to think of waiting outside the school gates. Then she took him upstairs to Mrs. Marisol's apartment, where the windows faced the backyard, instead of the street. Micah believed he'd been excused from school for some reason involving the broken oven, and the boy was entirely satisfied with that explanation. He spent the afternoon sitting at Mrs. Marisol's dining table with his box of colored pencils, drawing her standing over a pot, including her flowered apron and her slippers, then signing to his sister that the picture had to be hung in the kitchen and wasn't allowed to be put away. Mrs. Marisol picked up the drawing and studied it. She smiled, then turned away and wiped her eyes with the corner of her apron while the boy wasn't looking. Near evening, Tessa opened the diner's door and stepped onto the sidewalk exactly once. The cameras immediately closed around her. Someone asked whether she'd known he was Ruth Calloway. She said no. Someone asked whether she intended to speak in his defense. She said no. The crowd fell silent for a moment. Then someone asked why. Tessa looked directly into the nearest camera and said that the truth deserved to be defended, but secrets didn't. She said she wouldn't stand there and become evidence that lying was something romantic. Then she went back inside, locked the door, and turned off every light. At 3 o'clock in the morning, after every light in the building had gone dark and only the screen in front of him remained illuminated, Nico reopened the record he'd set aside after that night at the Marigold, the compensation settlement bearing the Barlow name. He opened the attachments one by one. The transportation records for the truck involved belonged to a small company at the lowest level of the logistics chain carrying his family's name, the kind of company he'd never heard of because it was too insignificant for anything involving it to reach his desk. He opened the driver's log. Then he opened it a second time in file history mode. The log had been altered. Not once, 3 times, across 2 consecutive days, and every alteration had been made after the incident, not before it. He compared the final version with the original. In the final version, the shift of a driver named Warren Ostrander began at dawn and ended within the permitted hours. In the original, that shift had begun the previous afternoon and never ended. No rest period had been recorded. No replacement driver had taken over. The man had been behind the wheel for nearly a full day before the incident occurred. Nico opened the internal correspondence next. There was a chain of messages between the dispatcher and his superior, and within it were sentences about quotas, about the shipment having to arrive before morning, about who would be held responsible that month if it didn't. That superior reported to one man, and that man reported to Curtis Vance. Nico continued reading until he reached the final section of the file. Less than 2 weeks later, a law firm had approached the surviving family. They brought a check and a document. The document was called a full settlement agreement, and its terms stated that the party accepting the money permanently waived the right to file suit, request an investigation, or disclose any related information. At the bottom of the page was a signature, the handwriting of a 23-year-old, unsteady and hurried, written by the hand of someone sitting in a room filled with unopened boxes. Nico sat motionless before the screen for a long time. Then he called Gideon Walsh. Gideon arrived within 40 minutes, still wearing a coat over his pajamas, and when he entered the room, Nico simply turned the screen toward him. Gideon looked at it for less than 5 seconds. Then he sat in the chair opposite Nico, placed both hands on his thighs, and didn't ask a single question. Nico said he wasn't surprised. Gideon said he wasn't. Nico asked how long he'd known. Gideon said he'd found it 2 years earlier during an audit Nico himself had ordered, and that he'd sat with it for an entire night, exactly as Nico was sitting with it now. Then he'd removed it from the reporting system, moved it into an archive folder no one ever opened, and told no one. Nico asked why. Gideon was silent for a moment. Then he said it was because he'd known what Nico would do, that Nico wouldn't hand the matter to the lawyers or treat it as a problem to be managed. He would find every person involved, beginning with that dispatcher and working his way upward, and he wouldn't stop with Curtis. That at the time, Nico had been only 32 years old, had occupied his father's position for only a short while, and half the people in the conference room had been waiting for him to make a mistake large enough to destroy him. Gideon said that if Nico tore everything apart over this, the person who ended up torn apart wouldn't be Curtis Vance. It would be Nico. Nico rose from his chair. He walked to the window and stood there with his back turned. Gideon continued, his voice growing hoarse, saying he'd thought about it for a very long time and still believed he'd made the right choice, that he hadn't hidden it from Nico for money, for Curtis, or for anyone else. He said he'd hidden it because he thought he was protecting Nico. Nico didn't turn around. He stood there, looking down at the lights along the street, and said Gideon had just spoken the exact words he'd used with her. No other sound followed in the room. Gideon Walsh remained seated with his hands resting on his thighs, and he didn't say another word. Morning came, and Nico was still sitting in the same place. He didn't open another file. He simply sat there and arranged each event in its proper order, and when he finished, he understood something he wished he hadn't. The business of someone knocking on the doors of small establishments in Carroll Gardens, the matter he'd gone down to investigate personally because it involved his family's name, had never been about those properties. No one intended to take over any buildings. There was no new owner. They'd gone to the laundromat, the shoe repair shop, and several businesses at the far end of the street. But those visits had only been there to complete the picture, to make it look like an ordinary matter involving money. The only place that person truly needed was Mrs. Marisol Ortega's diner, and what he needed wasn't the lease. He needed to know one thing. After all those years, did the young woman who had signed that settlement agreement still possess the records? He couldn't risk asking her himself, because if he appeared, she might remember whom she'd met and where. He couldn't send one of his own people, because anyone who went would eventually report to one man, and that man was Nico. So he'd created a problem just large enough to force Nico himself to go down there. He knew Nico wouldn't entrust the matter to anyone else. He knew Nico would go in person. He knew Nico would use another name and ask for a copy of the lease, and all he had to do was stand somewhere far away and watch which door Nico entered. Nico sat there, remembering the first morning he'd pushed open the Marigold's door, remembering how he'd believed he was acting with perfect discretion. He hadn't gone looking for her. He'd been led to her. And through all those weeks, every morning he sat down at table 6. Every time he paid and stepped onto the sidewalk, he'd confirmed once more for the person watching from a distance that yes, this was the place, and this was the woman. He went to the diner that afternoon. She opened the door for him, but stood in the doorway instead of inviting him inside. He told her he had something he needed to say, and that it wasn't about the previous day. Before she could answer, a car pulled up beside the curb, and the man who stepped out wore a dress shirt and carried a briefcase. Tessa went completely still when she saw him. Grant Mercer said her name. He said he knew she didn't want to see him, and that he needed only 5 minutes. He glanced at Nico, then looked back at her, and said he'd seen the news, that he knew the case was being reopened, and that she needed to hear him before she did anything. Tessa asked what he was talking about. Grant remained silent a moment too long. Then he said that years earlier, when he was still a junior lawyer, he'd worked at the firm that handled a settlement. He said he'd drafted the agreement with his own hands, that he'd typed every line, printed it, and given it to someone else to deliver. He said that when the two of them met at the diner 2 years later, he'd recognized her surname within the first 3 seconds, and he'd had exactly 3 seconds to tell her the truth, but he'd chosen not to. Then those 3 seconds stretched into 2 years. He said he hadn't left because he'd stopped loving her. He'd left because every morning he woke beside her was another time he'd lied to her, and he couldn't bear it anymore. He said he had a family now, and a position, and that if the matter was uncovered, he would lose everything. and he begged her. Tessa stood there for a long time. Then she said that for those 2 years, he'd loved her only where no one else could see, and she'd believed he was ashamed of her. She said she understood now. He hadn't been hiding her at all, he'd been hiding himself. She stepped backward into the diner and closed the door. Grant Mercer remained on the sidewalk for another moment, then got into his car and drove away. Inside the diner, Tessa turned to Nico and asked what he'd come to tell her. He looked at her and spoke the most painful words he'd ever said in his life, that he hadn't brought danger to her. He was the road they'd taken to reach her. The following night, Gideon Walsh went down to the office building's underground parking garage and discovered that someone had paid a visit to his car. The windshield was cracked into a spider web, but hadn't collapsed. The doors hadn't been forced, and nothing was missing. Resting neatly in the center of the driver's seat was a photograph printed on ordinary paper. It showed an apartment door. There was no one in the picture. Nothing but the door, the worn doormat, and the brass number fixed to the wooden frame. Gideon knew whose door it was before he even picked up the photograph. He called Nico and said the image file had been traced to a copy shop on 5th Avenue in Bay Ridge, and that the owner remembered the man who had printed it because he'd spent 20 minutes standing there arguing with the machine. Within an hour, they had a name, an address, and even an apartment number. Nico didn't call anyone. He didn't send anyone. He took his own car keys and drove to Bay Ridge alone, arriving at 2 o'clock in the morning. The elevator in the building was working. He didn't use it. He took the stairs to the 5th floor without hurrying, his hands in his pockets, the sound of his shoes against the concrete steps the only noise in the entire stairwell. He knocked 3 times, each knock evenly spaced. The man who opened the door wore a t-shirt, his hair flattened on one side, and it took him exactly 2 seconds to understand whom he was looking at. He stepped backward. Nico walked in. He didn't ask permission. He looked around the small living room, saw the gray fabric sofa, and sat down, leaning back with one hand resting on the arm, like a guest who had arrived early. The other man remained standing in the middle of the room. Nico asked whether he had coffee. The man stood motionless for a moment, then went into the kitchen. When he returned with 2 cups, his hands were trembling so badly that the coffee spilled over the rims. Nico accepted 1 cup, placed it on the table, and didn't drink. Then he began to speak. He said the man's wife's name, including her maiden name. He named the school the man's daughter attended, and even her homeroom teacher. He stated the amount of the man's debt, accurate to the last dollar, then named the person to whom it was owed, and when that name was spoken, the man collapsed into the chair opposite Nico as though someone had pulled the bones from his legs. Nico said all of it in the voice of someone reading from a menu. He never raised his voice. He didn't stand. He didn't touch anything in the man's home except the cup of coffee he never drank. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his coat, took out the photograph, unfolded it, and placed it on the table between them, turning it so the man could see it clearly. He said the man had gone to that place, stood in that hallway, and taken a photograph of her door. The man opened his mouth to say something. Nico continued, cutting him off in the same voice, saying that he had no need to photograph the man's home. He said he was already sitting inside it. The only sound left in the room was the refrigerator humming in the kitchen. Nico remained seated for another moment, then stood, fastened the button of his coat, and thanked the man for the coffee. He walked to the door, opened it, then paused and said that if anyone asked what had happened that night, the man should simply tell the truth, because he wouldn't be able to remember a single lie convincing enough to tell. Then he closed the door and took the stairs back down. The man remained sitting in the darkness with 2 cups of cold coffee on the table until morning. When Nico reached his car, Gideon was waiting beside the curb. He didn't ask what had happened upstairs. He only said Nico should take her out of the city for a few weeks. Nico stood beside the car door and looked up at the 5th floor, where one window was still illuminated. He said that for all these weeks, Gideon had kept asking why he hadn't told her the truth, and Gideon still believed it was because he was afraid of losing her. Nico said it wasn't. He said he wasn't afraid of losing her. He was afraid of having her. He said that if she chose him, what she would be choosing wasn't a man. It was this night and every night, like it for the rest of her life. It was knowing that every time she stepped outside, someone might be standing across the street. It was knowing that the boy would grow up having to learn a different route home. He opened the car door and said he hadn't remained silent to keep her. He'd remained silent, so he wouldn't have to hear her say yes. He reached his apartment shortly before 4 o'clock in the morning, and found the kitchen light on. Bianca Ferrante sat on a high stool at the kitchen island, still wearing her coat, her feet resting on the crossbar. with a cup of tea before her that she'd made using his kettle without asking permission. She said he'd disappeared for 3 days without answering a single message, and that if he intended to die somewhere, the least he could do was send his sister one word. He said he'd been busy. She said the whole of America was watching him be busy. Then she reached down to the bag at her feet, pulled out 3 books, and threw them onto the island, one of them sliding so far it nearly fell to the floor. 3 paperback covers, each with the name Ruth Calloway printed in the lower corner. She pointed to the book on top and said, "This one right here." She said that the previous year, she'd been sitting at an airport gate while her flight was delayed for 3 hours, and she'd reached the passage about the woman clearing out her mother's closet after the funeral. She said she'd cried there, truly cried, so hard that an elderly woman in the next seat had handed her a packet of tissues, cried in front of 200 strangers in the coffee stand. Then she looked at him and said that for that entire hour, she'd sat there thinking the woman who had written those words must understand her better than her own brother did. Nico stood beside the refrigerator and said nothing. Bianca punched him once in the shoulder, not hard, only hard enough to express what she didn't know how to put into words. Then she sat down again and remained silent for a long while. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. She said she had only one question, and she wanted him to answer honestly. He told her to ask. She asked why Ruth could say everything, why that woman who didn't exist could write about what it was like to miss someone, what it was like to feel guilty, what it was like to be afraid, when her own brother hadn't said a single word to her about their mother in all those years. Nico stood there for a long time. Then he pulled out the other chair and sat across from his sister. He said she'd been only 18 when their mother died. He said the entire family, the outsiders, even the people who came to the funeral and shook his hand at the church door, had all looked at him and waited for the same thing. They were waiting to see whether he would remain standing. No one asked whether he was all right. They asked what he planned to do next. He said everyone expected him to become strong, so he became strong, because at the time, it was the only thing he knew how to do, and the only thing anyone allowed him to do. He said no one expected anything from Ruth. No one demanded that she be strong. No one stood watching to see whether she would collapse, so she was allowed to be honest. He said that every time he sat down to answer a letter from a stranger, for that brief span of time, he was allowed to be someone who could say that he was hurting too. Bianca sat in silence. She wiped her face quickly with the back of her hand, the way people do when they don't want anyone to see in time. Then she reached across the island and took her brother's hand. She said he'd carried all of it alone for all those years. He said he'd believed he was protecting everyone. Bianca tightened her grip on his hand and said he'd been wrong. Outside the window, the sky was beginning to brighten, and no one in the kitchen said anything more. Nico Ferrante sat there with his hand resting in his sister's, and for the first time since the year their mother died, he didn't try to pull away. Curtis Vance didn't call. He summoned a meeting, and that was what made it remarkable, because in all those years, no one but Nico had ever called a meeting in that room. 12 men sat around the long table, the heads of the various divisions, men who had occupied those seats since his father's time. No one said a word. Nico entered last and took his place, while Curtis Vance sat opposite him at the other end of the table, with one hand resting on a thin file. He didn't waste time. He said he needed Nico's signature transferring complete control of the harbor division to him, and he was giving Nico 72 hours. Someone at the far end of the table drew in a breath. Nico asked what would happen if he refused. Curtis opened the file, turned it around, and sent it sliding across the table toward him. It was a list of names. Not the names of rivals, not the names of officials, not anything the 12 men in that room had expected to see. It was a list of the families that had received assistance from the Calloway Fund over all those years. Curtis said he would give it to the press. He said that by the following morning, every name on that list would belong to a family that had accepted money from the Ferrante organization. The wife working at the hospital would be suspended pending an internal investigation. The man working at the docks would be struck from the union rolls. The child in their second year of college would have their scholarship suspended. And every application awaiting approval, every file submitted by people counting down the days, would be frozen at once, because no hospital in the city would dare accept money from a fund under investigation for money laundering. Curtis said those people would never know why. They would know only that one morning, the thing they'd been waiting for had disappeared. Nico pulled the pages closer. He turned them one by one. He didn't read quickly, and on the 4th page, among the perfectly even lines of typed text, There was an entry for an 11-year-old boy in Carroll Gardens, accompanied by a case number, a filing date, and the words pending in the final column. His finger paused there for exactly 1 beat before he turned the page. No one in the room saw him stop. Curtis Vance continued, his voice softer now, almost intimate, the voice of a man who had waited years to say these words. He said he'd been sitting in that room since before Nico even knew where to place his own signature, that he'd watched Nico build everything one piece at a time, and what Nico had built wasn't a company or a harbor operation. It was fear. He said the entire city straightened in its chair when it heard Nico's name, and that was the only asset a man like him truly possessed. Then he said Nico had traded that asset away, traded it for the right to sit alone at night and feel like a decent man. No one in the room moved. Nico closed the file, pushed it back toward the center of the table, and asked Curtis when he'd begun believing Nico was decent. Curtis didn't answer. Nico said he'd never believed himself to be a decent man, not for a single day, and that if Curtis thought those letters were the work of a decent man, then he hadn't read them. Then, in the same voice, he continued, saying there was something Curtis should know before leaving that room. Of the 12 men sitting there, 3 had been reporting to Nico about Curtis for months. He didn't say which 3. He didn't look toward anyone. He simply finished speaking and sat in silence. Not one of the 12 heads around the table turned toward another. Curtis Vance remained in his seat, and in that moment, he understood that everything he'd done over the previous 6 years, every call he'd believed was private, every payment he'd believed had been routed far enough away, might have been sitting on the desk of the man opposite him for a very long time. But he still held the list. He rose, fastened his coat, and said 72 hours. Then he walked out. The door closed behind him, and no one in the room spoke until Nico rose first. The 72nd hour passed on a Thursday afternoon, and Nico Ferrante didn't sign. He sat in his office throughout the afternoon, with the papers still lying exactly where Curtis had left them, and he didn't touch the pen once. Curtis Vance didn't call again either. He didn't need to. The following morning, a complaint was filed with the federal authorities alleging that the Callaway Fund was being used to move money for the Ferrante organization under the guise of charity. The complaint didn't need to be true. It only needed to be filed. The bank received notice before opening and did what every bank did under those circumstances. It suspended all the fund's accounts for review, without warning or consulting anyone. And within the payment systems of every hospital connected to the fund, the status of each application changed from one word to another during the same morning. The following day was Micah's surgery. Tessa brought him to the hospital at 6 o'clock in the morning. The boy had changed into a hospital gown, a baggy one printed with tiny boats, and he sat on the edge of the bed swinging his legs, wide awake despite having eaten nothing since the previous evening. He signed to his sister that the gown was ugly. Tessa signed back that it was, but because it was free, he wasn't allowed to complain. Micah laughed. Then he sat up straight, his face suddenly serious, and signed that he had an important question. He asked what she would say first when the machine was turned on, and he could hear. He said he'd been thinking about it for weeks, and he wanted her to prepare in advance and not say something ordinary like, "Can you hear me?" Tessa laughed and signed that she would think about it. Micah signed that she'd better think of something good. At that moment, the door opened. The person who entered wasn't a doctor. She was an administrative employee carrying a file, and her very first words were an apology. She said the source of payment for the procedure had been suspended that morning, that the system wouldn't allow them to proceed, and that under hospital procedure, the surgical slot for that day would be given to the next patient on the waiting list. Tessa asked when Micah could be rescheduled. The woman looked down at the file in her hands for a long time before answering, and her answer was that the current waiting list was more than a year long. Tessa stood there. She didn't ask another question. She turned to the nurse standing in the doorway and said, in the most ordinary voice she could manage, that her brother was feeling a little tired that day, that it was probably because he'd gotten up so early, and asked whether he could rest in the room a little longer. Then she signed to Micah that she was going out to get some water and would be back in 2 minutes. The boy nodded. She stepped into the hallway, walked about 10 paces to the bend where a plastic chair stood against the wall, and sat down. Then she folded forward, covered her head with both hands, and cried, without a sound. She cried in the way of someone who had spent 4 years learning to cry silently so no one else in the house would hear. The hallway was stark white, the sound of a cart rolling somewhere far away, and no one passed by. Inside the room, Micah had turned over the nursing form hanging at the head of the bed, asked the nurse for a pen, and was drawing her portrait. He included the butterfly-shaped hair clip and the way she raised one eyebrow. When he finished and held it up, the nurse laughed, and Micah laughed with her, loudly, his laughter a little louder than usual, as it always was. Nico arrived at the hospital before 7 o'clock that evening. He found Tessa in a hallway on a lower floor, and he didn't waste time asking questions. He said he would pay the full amount that very night, not through the fund or any organization, but with his own money, transferred directly to the hospital, and the surgery would be rescheduled for that week. He said he'd already called, and all she had to do was nod. Tessa looked at him. She said no. He said her name. She said no again, more slowly this time. She said she'd worked 2 shifts a day for the past 4 years, that she'd paid every installment, month after month, and had never been more than 2 weeks late, that she'd signed every piece of paper, stood in every line, submitted every set of documents, and waited. Then she asked what those 4 years would mean if she accepted his money that night. He couldn't answer. She walked home that night instead of taking the train. When she reached the apartment, she didn't turn on the living room light. She went straight to the bedroom, knelt beside the bed, reached underneath it, and pulled out the cardboard box she hadn't opened in 4 years. The box was lighter than she'd expected. Inside were the things she'd placed there during those first 3 weeks, and never touched again. The papers for the house, a stack of photographs, her mother's old savings book, and at the very bottom, a large yellow envelope from the insurance company, its edge still sealed, never opened. She sat down on the floor and tore it open. Inside was the preliminary compensation file, the documents the insurance company was required to send the family before any settlement could be finalized. 4 years earlier, when it arrived, she'd been 23 years old, and she hadn't opened it because she couldn't bear to see her parents' names printed on a company's paperwork. She turned through the pages, one by one. Near the end, tucked between the forms, was a copy of the driver's log, the original version, the one the insurance company had received during the first week, before anyone had time to touch the system. The driving shift began the previous afternoon. There was no rest period. There was no replacement driver. She sat on the bedroom floor with the 2 pages resting in her lap until morning, and she understood something she would think about for a very long time afterward. Several months after the accident, someone had knocked on the door of her old apartment, claiming to be from the claims department, and saying they needed to retrieve some documents that had been sent by mistake. But by then, she'd already moved away. She'd moved because she couldn't afford that month's rent, and she'd left so hastily that she hadn't had time to submit a change of address for her mail. They couldn't find her, and they had assumed she'd thrown everything away, because she'd signed the other paper, and why would anyone who had signed it keep anything? Her poverty had preserved the one thing no one wanted to exist. 3 days later, Tessa took 2 buses to the northern part of the city. She told no one, not Mrs. Marisol, and not Nico. She found the address in the file itself, and she stood before a small house with a wooden fence that had been painted not long before, then knocked on the door. The man who answered was around 50, his hair almost entirely gray, and he wore an old sweater. He looked at her, and she saw that he recognized her immediately, not because he knew her face, but because he'd imagined this moment so many times that when it finally came, he didn't need to ask. Warren Ostrander didn't apologize. He didn't offer a single word in his own defense. He only stood there with one hand still resting on the door, then stepped backward and opened it wider. She went inside. His house was small and clean, with a dining table beside the window. He poured her a glass of water, then sat across from her. She said she'd read the driver's log. He nodded once. She asked why he hadn't testified. He remained silent for a long time. Then he said that while he was in there, someone had visited him exactly once, and the visitor wasn't his lawyer. They hadn't threatened him. They'd simply sat down and talked about his wife, about the shop where she worked, and about his daughter, about the school she attended, and about how everything would remain just as normal as it was if he kept his statement unchanged. He said he'd driven for 27 years and had never caused an accident. Then he said he'd pleaded guilty, and that he still accepted the blame even now, because he'd been the person behind the wheel that day, not anyone else. Then he stood, went into the next room, and returned with a worn hardcover notebook. He placed it on the table and pushed it toward her. She opened it. Page after page, written by hand, recorded the dates, the beginning and ending time of each shift, The dispatcher's messages copied word for word, every time he'd reported that he couldn't continue driving, and what they had told him in response. It began long before the day of the accident, and continued all the way to the present. He said he'd written it in case the day ever came when she visited him. He said he wanted to have something he could give her when it did. Tessa picked up the notebook. She held it in her hands for a long time without turning another page. Outside the window came the sound of children returning home from school. Then she raised her eyes to the man sitting across from her and asked what grade his daughter was in that year. That same afternoon, in his office, Nico reopened the file Curtis Vance had pushed across the table. He didn't open it to search for anything. He opened it to count. He needed to know exactly how many families would face the morning Curtis had described, how many people would be suspended from their jobs, how many pending applications would be closed, and he wanted that number in front of him, instead of inside his head. He took out a blank sheet of paper and began marking each line. He worked for more than an hour, neither rushing nor missing anything, and when he reached the bottom of the final page, the number he'd counted exceeded the number Curtis had given in the conference room by exactly one name. He counted again. There was still one extra, so he turned the file back to the beginning to find the line he'd overlooked. The list was arranged chronologically, with the oldest cases at the top. He'd never studied the first page closely, because it covered the years when the fund had helped only a few families annually, and he'd assumed he knew every name there. He looked down at the first line on the first page. The first family the Callaway Fund had ever assisted, many years earlier, case number 1, opened before the fund even had an official name. Ostrander. He read the surname again. Then he opened the attached file. The assistance had first been approved long ago, then renewed again, and over the previous 4 years, it had changed into another form, annual tuition assistance for a minor, with the name of the school and every payment period clearly recorded. The applicant was a woman. Her spouse was listed on the line below, accompanied by a note stating that he was serving a sentence. Nico sat before the file for a long time. He'd established that review board during the fund's earliest years, and he'd personally written the rule that he wasn't allowed to know. No names, no photographs, no specific circumstances. The board received applications, reviewed them according to set criteria, approved or declined them, and sent him only a total figure each quarter. He'd done it that way because he never wanted to sit there one day and decide who deserved help more than someone else. In all those years, he'd never opened a single case file. He opened the image of the original application. It was written in a woman's handwriting on graph paper, asking for help paying for her mother-in-law's medication. The signature dated back many years, to the time when he was still writing letters in the hospital. The driver hadn't caused anything then. At that time, he was only the husband of a woman who had written an application asking for help, and the fund had said yes. It had continued saying yes ever since, even through the years when no one on the board knew where the man named in the file was. Nico rose from his desk. He walked to the window, turned back, then stood in the middle of the room. Outside, darkness had fallen, and the buildings were illuminated. He said nothing. There was no one in the room to hear him. He returned to the desk and sat down, leaving the file open to that page, and stared at the surname for a long while longer. Then he took out his phone and dialed Tessa's number. It rang. He counted every ring. On the 4th, the call went to voicemail. He didn't leave a message. He ended the call, waited about a minute, then dialed again. This time, it rang fewer times before going to voicemail, the kind of shortened ringing that meant the phone was inside someone's pocket, and they'd just declined the call. He placed the phone face down on the desk and sat motionless in the darkened room. The prosecutor read every page Tessa brought him without interrupting her once. When he finished, he arranged the papers into a neat stack and told her exactly what she didn't want to hear. He said the original driver's log was authentic and the notebook was valuable, but that even together, they proved only one thing, that someone had altered the records. Nothing identified who had done it. He said that to follow the matter to its source, he needed someone on the inside, someone with access to the system, someone who could sit down and confirm where that chain of reporting led. Without that person, he said, these were only anonymous papers, and Curtis Vance wouldn't have to answer a single question. Tessa left the office and sat on a bench in the hallway of the federal building. She remained there for a long time. People passed back and forth before her. The elevator opened and closed again and again, and she stayed motionless with the phone in her hand. She'd declined his calls twice. She'd said she wouldn't stand as proof that lying was something romantic, and now she was sitting there, with the only thing left that might save her parents being to ask for help from the very man who had concealed the truth from her for all those weeks. She sat a while longer. Then she dialed the number. Gideon Walsh told Nico plainly what it would cost him that same evening. He said Nico wouldn't go to prison, that the scope of his testimony would be limited to accounting fraud committed by a transportation company Nico himself owned. But Gideon said that wasn't the price. The price was that from the day Nico sat before a federal prosecutor, the Ferrante name would no longer be untouchable in the eyes of every other family in the city. He said people would never fear Nico in the same way again, and it would take Nico years to understand just how costly that would be. Nico listened to everything. Then he turned to Tessa and asked her one question. He asked whether she would think differently of him if he did this. She said she didn't know. She said she promised him nothing. Not that she would return his calls. Not that she would forgive him. Not anything at all. He nodded once and said that was enough. The press conference took place 3 days later. The entire country waited for a denial. He placed a thin stack of papers on the podium, and in response to the first question, he said that he was Ruth Calloway. He'd written every letter. He didn't stop there. He said he hadn't invented the name. Ruth Calloway was his mother's maiden name. Before she married and took the Ferrante surname, she'd written a small column for the parish newsletter under that name, and she'd stopped writing after her wedding and never mentioned it again for the rest of her life. He said that 3 days before she died, she'd asked him to write one final reply for someone who had sent her a letter she hadn't yet answered. She dictated, and he wrote. He said he'd written that letter, and after she died, he hadn't been able to stop. He spoke the next sentence more slowly than all the others. He said he hadn't been hiding behind an imaginary woman. He'd only been keeping a real woman alive a little longer. For several seconds, no one in the press room asked a question. When someone asked about the woman from the diner in Carroll Gardens, he said she'd known only the man he'd allowed her to know, that this had been unfair to her, and that the fault was entirely his. Curtis Vance was indicted at the end of that week. There was no spectacle, only a file and a car parked outside his house at 7 o'clock in the morning. The complaint was withdrawn, the investigation changed direction, and the Calloway Fund's accounts were released within 9 days. The final thing Nico did was sell his entire stake in 3 legitimate logistics companies, the cleanest and most profitable businesses he owned, so the fund could be transferred to an independent board with not a single thread connecting it to his family name. Gideon watched him sign the final page and said he hoped Nico understood how much he'd just lost. Nico capped the pen, pushed the papers aside, and said he'd just bought back his mother's signature. Many weeks passed, and nothing happened at all. No flowers were sent to the diner. No stranger walked in and quietly paid someone else's bill. No one called to say everything had been taken care of. The new independent board that assumed control of the fund reopened every pending application, according to a fully transparent process, and Micah's file was there among hundreds of others, reviewed in the exact order of its submission date. Tessa checked 3 times. The first time through the online portal, the second by calling the service center, and the third by going to the board's office herself, waiting the entire morning, and asking one direct question, whether anyone had interfered with this application. They showed her the complete review log. No one had interfered. The surgery took place on a March morning, and the weeks that followed were the longest Tessa had ever lived through, because the device needed time to heal before it could be activated. On the day it was turned on, she sat in the clinic with both hands clasped tightly together. The technician explained that the first sounds would seem very strange, that they might not resemble anything the boy remembered. And Micah nodded as though he were listening to instructions for assembling a toy. Then the device was activated. Micah sat still. He didn't startle or cry out. He simply sat there, his eyes growing wider, his head tilted slightly to one side like a bird listening. The technician spoke a few words. He blinked. Then he turned to his sister and signed that her voice sounded different from the way he remembered it. Tessa burst into tears in the middle of the clinic, crying loudly, crying in a way she hadn't allowed herself to cry in 4 years. Micah began to laugh. He signed for her to stop crying, that he couldn't hear anything except her tears, and that he wanted to hear her speak. So she wiped her face and spoke. She said his name. She told him he owed her a better portrait than the one he'd drawn before. Micah roared with laughter, the sound a little louder than usual, and this time he heard it. One Tuesday morning, the bell above the Marigold's door rang twice. Nico entered alone, with no one beside him, and only a manuscript in his hands. Everyone in the diner recognized him at once, and several heads turned. Tessa called out that he was only there for breakfast and asked everyone to please continue eating. There was a ripple of quiet laughter. Then everyone returned to their coffee. He placed the manuscript on the counter. The cover had no title, only the author's name printed in the center. Nico Ferrante. She opened it, and the first page wasn't chapter 1. It was a dedication that read, "For the woman who kept my words in her wallet for 4 years and made me become worthy of them before allowing me to stand beside her." He didn't ask her to forgive him. He only said that he wanted to invite her to dinner as himself, and he said it in the middle of the diner, in front of everyone. Dinner took place in the Marigold's kitchen after closing because that was what she chose. They spoke about his mother, her parents, Micah, and the letters. Neither of them pretended that the things that had happened had never happened. Then she asked which of all the letters he'd written was most like him. He said none of them, because every one of those letters had expressed the very thing he hadn't dared to say with his own mouth. She told him to try one sentence. The man who had once made an entire warehouse at the Red Hook docks hold its breath simply by pulling out a chair and sitting down needed nearly a full minute to speak 3 words. 9 months later, the Marigold still belonged to Mrs. Marisol Ortega, and no one had ever offered to buy it. Tessa returned to culinary school in the evenings and paid her own tuition with her own money. And he'd asked her about it exactly once and never asked again, which was his way of saying he respected her. The portrait drawn on the back of that old receipt was now framed and hanging in his office among the harbor contracts. On Tuesday mornings, Mrs. Marisol still pulled a chair into the middle of the aisle and read letters aloud to the regulars. The only difference was that the author now sat at table 6, and Mrs. Rosetta still told him directly to his face that he'd rushed the ending this time. He opened his mouth to argue. Tessa pointed at him and said, "Don't." The whole diner laughed. This story leaves us with 3 lessons. Concealment is never protection, because no one can love a person they were never allowed to see. Kindness doesn't make anyone weak. What makes a person weak is having to live an entire lifetime under a name that isn't their own. And a poor woman burdened with debt and raising her younger brother alone still has the right to say no, and that right requires no one's permission. If today's story touched your heart, please subscribe to our channel, leave a like, and share it so we can listen to more meaningful stories together every day. How do you feel about Tessa and Nico? And what would you have chosen in their place? Please leave a few words in the comments. We sincerely want to hear what you feel in the deepest part of your heart. May you and your family always enjoy good health, happiness, and peace in your lives each day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next video.